So today, my first question is, to what extent do you know about the differences in cuisine between like Beijing and Hong Kong? Do you know of any foods that they like to eat there?
I imagine that they would probably have more Western influence, somewhat in Hong Kong, just because of the fact that it was a British colony, and Portuguese colony just across the way there at Macau. So I imagine there's maybe a little more Western influence, and I imagine that Shanghai is probably more traditional.
Right. Do you know of any language differences between Beijing and Hong Kong? Mainly dialectical differences.
Well, Shanghai is further north, so maybe they'd have more of a northern accent.
Oh, it's Beijing, not.
Oh, Beijing, sorry.
Well, but they have the same. Yeah.
But, they're further south, and I know that there are variations in the accents, the way people speak Chinese in the south versus the north, and sometimes it's like they have a hard time understanding each other, even though it's the same language. So I imagine there's an accent. I don't know what it's called, or how drastic it is.
Okay. Are you familiar with any of the writing systems of Chinese?
It's all done. A single symbol means one thing.
Right.
To be literate, I heard you have to know at least 3,000 symbols. So to be literate, to speak it is one thing. To actually be able to write it and read it is another. So it's difficult to do since it's all symbolic. It's not like an alphabet where you put words together.
So are you familiar with like traditional and simplified Chinese?
Heard of them, but can't give you details.
Okay. Yeah. Do you know anything about interesting festivals or customs in Beijing and Hong Kong? Do you know any similarities or differences in how they're celebrated?
I know that the big is New Year's. Chinese New Year's is huge all over Asia, whether they call it Tet like in Vietnam or New Year's. I don't know if there's differences in the way they celebrate it, but I know it's kind of like Christmas and birthdays and 4th of July. It's everything all wrapped up into one. And people a lot of times will give lucky money in little red or yellow envelopes, again, depending on like Vietnam, there's sometimes yellow envelopes.
Right.
So there's lucky money, you clean everything, you clean the house, you have lots of food, certain kinds of foods that are kind of traditional for the New Year, and there's lots of parties, and you visit lots of family members and friends and stuff like that, and you're kind of starting the New Year in an auspicious way.
Right. Okay. So, to what extent do you know about the geographical features of Beijing and Hong Kong, and do you know how they differ in I guess the location of where they are in China?
Well, Hong Kong is on the coast and it's in the south and it's warm. It's like subtropical.
Right.
And then Beijing is further north. It's inland, and it gets cold in the winter. It's probably pretty hot and humid in the summer, and then it can get cold and snowy in the winter.
Right. Okay. Would you think how would this affect their lifestyles? Do you have any idea of how they would change because of this?
I imagine that. Geography does affect how people are. Sometimes maybe in Hong Kong they might be a little more casual, and sometimes, I don't know. I think sometimes that regions sometimes reflect, it can be seen in their cuisine, and maybe there's more spicy foods, maybe even more in Beijing than in China, because I've had different kinds of Chinese cuisine, and I've always found that it's not Szechuan, but it's another one. It's a little more bland, but it's further in the south, and then in the north it tends to be spicier.
Right.
And like I've had Mongolian barbecue, and that's really spicy. And I think it's Szechuan cuisine that kind of has a lot of peppers and heat to it, and I think that's further north.
So, to what extent are you familiar with the government systems of Beijing and Hong Kong?
Beijing is communist. The home base of the Communist Party in China, and Hong Kong until 1999 was a British territory, and then it was given over, and they're part of China now, but it's kind of it's a special territorial status, but as time has gone on, they have limited more and more of the freedoms, the freedom of the press and freedom to speak out and whatnot. And there's a lot of people there that are protesting because they're losing that freedom that they had, that they expected, because it's becoming more and more controlled by the Chinese up in Beijing and the rest of the country. And even before that happened, I knew that there was lots of Chinese people that were moving out of Hong Kong and to the United States, and especially California and like San Francisco, just because they wanted to get out of it before the communists took over. So it is slowly being more absorbed into the Chinese government, Communist Party, and they're losing more and more rights that they had. So it's been a source of conflict. And I think the other one was the protests, and they would hold up like a blank piece of paper, and that they weren't saying anything, but they were saying a lot by that blank piece of paper. So.
Right. Okay. So are you familiar with the educational systems of Beijing and Hong Kong, and do you know any key differences between them, or maybe differences between Hong Kong and Beijing and the U.S.?
From what I understand, their system, I don't know the differences between Beijing and Hong Kong. I mean, I again imagine that they probably have perhaps more of a Western influence, just because of the fact that there's been a Western influence there for a very long time. But I know that the system in China is different from the United States, where there are students that take tests. It determines what kind of high school they go to, whether they go into a vocational school or they go to an academic high school. It's mostly a lot of memorization, a lot of the teacher lecturing, the student taking notes, and there's not a lot of, my understanding, not a lot of, letting the students figure things out. They just are listening to what the teacher is saying and doing what the teacher is telling them to do without a lot of creative thought or questioning on their own.
Right. Okay. So do you know any of the popular youth activities that are partaking in Beijing and Hong Kong?
Soccer, I'm thinking, somewhat, and then
this could also include any protests that they're specifically doing. Do you know of any specific things they're protesting?
Protesting?
Yeah.
As far as I know that there was the Tiananmen uprising in the late 80s, I think it was, in Beijing, and there was the tank man and all that stuff, and a lot of those people disappeared, and so they occasionally have people that maybe attempt to protest stuff, but then the government steps in and squashes it really quickly, and I think they're more bold in what they're protesting in Hong Kong, because they feel like they can and they have a tradition, but then people there are also disappearing. And they're electing officials, sometimes electing, and it's a rigging thing, so that the people that are getting into positions of power in Hong Kong are friendlier to Beijing than the people in the past were. So they're kind of doing what Beijing wants without any protest, because they're the ones, in positions of authority. So, if that's what you mean by activities, political activities.
Sports.
Sports. I think that that there's probably martial arts of different kinds. There's maybe kung fu or karate or tai chi. Soccer, I think, is big. Tennis, maybe, I don't know.
Mainly they play more badminton. Than tennis.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, that's the end of my questions. So thank you. Yeah.